Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 7 of our supernatural folklore class. Please do not forget that you have a quiz this week. It's quiz number 3, and it covers ghosts, which were weeks 5, 6, and this week 7. We are getting close to the halfway point of the class. So next week is week 8. That's officially the halfway point. So next week you have your midterm exam. I feel like you probably have questions about the midterm, so here's what I can tell you about it. I will put the midterm online. It will open on Monday, October the 11th. I usually open that at 9 a.m. You need to complete the exam before 11:59 p.m. On Sunday. Um, with your quizzes, it's like with your quizzes, it's not timed. And if you cannot complete it in one setting, you can save it and come back to it and complete it. There will be multiple choice questions, there will be true or false questions, and there will be short answer questions. Now, sometimes I do recycle questions. Sometimes I turn short answer questions into true or false into multiple choice. So if you have, you will need to look at your old quizzes, and if you missed questions on the quizzes, look up the correct answers. All right. You also may use your readings. Um, so if you need those while you're taking the midterm, please use them. Now, I have given feedback on all of the research paper proposals. Finished that up last week. This week, a couple of you have gotten back to me because I told you needed to narrow your topics down. A lot of times, students feel like if they leave their topics really, really broad, they have an easier time making 5 to 7 pages. This is not true. Please trust me. You will have a much better time if you will try to keep your topic narrow. It will be much easier for you to do your research um, if you have a specific topic in mind. You have to have at least one primary source. So that could be a story, that could be a movie, it could be a book, it could be a legend trip. There has to be something that you're analyzing, right? So you have to have this primary source, which means if you're thinking about writing on a general topic like vampires, you need to pick either a movie that you're going to be analyzing or a book that you're going to be analyzing or something like that. So you have to have a primary source. Then you will need to have a couple of secondary sources. At least two of your secondary sources must be from folklore research, and I would suggest, if you are looking for that, to go into the research guides and look under folklore. There are a couple of databases that keep folklore journals in there. There's Western Folklore, there's the Journal of American Folklore, and the JSTOR is a database that keeps those journals in it. Project Muse is another one that tends to have folklore journals in it. Remember, you have to have two sources from folklore journals or from a folklore source. It could be a book, um, but it has to be scholarly and it has to be from the field of folklore. Um, Remember that your analysis is the primary feature of this paper. The research that you're using should support your analysis. So you need to have a thesis statement, and the research should bolster your thesis statement. Um, Ask questions if you have them. I really do want you to do well on this paper. I'm happy to give you feedback at any stage of your writing. If you're pre-writing and trying to figure it out, that's fine. I'm happy to talk with you about that. Your other option is that there's a writing center here on campus. It's one of the resources that's available to you. So if you need that, please use it. Um, this week, because you have the midterm next week, and I want you to be prepared for that, and because you have a quiz this week, we only have one article, and you will have your discussion board this week, but we only have one article to read. So that article is called Haunted Habitability, Wilderness, and American Haunted House Narratives. So in this one, Wilson is analyzing haunted houses from the perspective of eco-criticism. Her analysis is linked to the environment and how people shape the environment to suit their needs. So last week we talked about from Greider's article that the haunted house functions as a kind of metaphor, and that stories about haunted houses reveal anxiety about everyday life. So Greider said that was financial stability, personal safety, moral obligations, psychological stability. Haunted house stories reveal inhabitants that are often trapped financially and emotionally in some way, right? And so I think I gave you guys some examples of this. Like if you look at films like The Conjuring, um, where you have someone who is living in a house and they can't afford to leave the house for whatever reason. Usually they bought the house because it was cheap, but then they can't move out of the house and they're sort of trapped there with whatever presence is there. You also see that in the Amityville movies, and that comes up at different points. The Witch in the Window is another film that kind of plays on that trope. So, Wilson's discussion here supports those ideas up to a point. She characterizes haunted houses as presenting, quote, deeply subversive critiques of all that we hold to be true about class, about race, about gender, and about American history itself. And she says that on page 200. At the most basic level, haunted house stories explore the relationships between subjects and their home space. So this is where eco-criticism comes in. She's saying that haunted houses are conceived of as a kind of wilderness space that must be made habitable. But like most wilderness spaces, they can't exactly be made completely habitable without completely subjugating their natural factors, right? So when we go in, basically the idea is that when we go into the wilderness, you have to basically clear everything out before you can inhabit that space. And she's saying that haunted houses are sort of the same way. Um, they have to be cleared out. Um, they have to be subjugated in some way. So eco critics call on this um, increased place attachment to create a positive, effective relationship and close connective to the environment, right? So as you inhabit the space, you put your stamp on it, right? This is increased place attachment. Here, Wilson says that haunted houses, quote, defy the boundaries between domestic and natural space, the wild and the domesticated, the subject, the object, the animate, and the inanimate. Thus, the haunted house calls into question and reveals tension in the ways that we subordinate wilderness spaces, right? Generally, we like the view, but we have to clear out space to have our house. Um, so we have to make changes to the wilderness in order to inhabit it. We have to clear out the wildlife, for example, so that we can have our home there or whatever. She uses these notions of lived space, which she defines as the everyday spaces we live, work, and shop. Perceived space, which she says that's the way spaces feel, look, smell, the sensory interaction that we have with them, and conceived space, the way we think about our space or form an attachment to a space we have only thought about. For example, you may see pictures of a place and form an attachment to that place without ever having been there, right? When she talks about perceived space, that's the way spaces feel or look or smell, right? Um, I generally always know when I'm at my grandmother's, like the smell of bleach always makes me think of my grandmother's house, because my grandmother has a particular affection for bleach and she bleaches everything. She cleans with it, she washes with it, all the things, right? So her house generally smells like bleach. Um, I associate that smell with her house. Um, we take great pride in the way that we arrange or decorate our houses because we're invested in the way they look. Um, we pick certain furnishings because of the way that they feel. So that's our perceived space. Um, she also argues that characters in haunted houses are preoccupied with possession. And she says this is particularly true of women. She argues that women invest in homes as part of their identity and that haunted houses resist being possessed or controlled, right? um, and while that isn't exactly in the scope of eco criticism, she does make an interesting point about gender roles in haunted house stories. For example, women use traditional housekeeping methods to subdue the house, while men try to use exploratory techniques if they admit what's happening at all rather than deny or remain absent until crisis erupts. Right? So, if you've seen the film, say, Poltergeist, right? The mother and the daughter in that film um, are pretty in tune with what's going on in their house, while dad is either away at work. When he comes home, they tell him about it, but he kind of refuses to believe that anything's going on. Um, the same for something like um, The Conjuring, where dad is away at work often and leaves the females at home to kind of mind the house, right? So when things start to go wrong in the house, it's the women that are there. The men aren't there at all until something really terrible happens. She also says that haunted houses present never ending caretaking by women in order to remain modestly habitable, and that in this way, women are trapped in domesticity by the haunted house. So she says that, for example, women clean up the mess. They typically, when a house is haunted for some reason, there's bad smells, so women will clean and try to get rid of the smells. When there's a poltergeist throwing crap all over the house, the women are the ones that pick it all up. And that's kind of part of her argument there. And she says what that represents is women being trapped in domesticity by the house itself. Wilson also argues that this trope of a house built on Indian burial ground, say the house that happens in Nathaniel Hawthorne's The House of Seven Gables, that happens in the film Poltergeist, that happens in. It's a trope that seems to come up pretty often. And she says that this trope reveals white guilt about land use in America. Um, So, what I want you to think about in particular this week are the last two ideas that she presents here. How does this square with what we have learned so far about haunted houses? Because we've talked about them for the last 2 weeks. What does this reveal about women's roles? Does this square with um, your experience, if you think about your life experience or what you've seen, does that idea about women being trapped in domesticity seem to be effective here? The other thing I want you to think about is, are there changes that you might expect to see based on changing values in our society? Remember how we talked about functionalism and we said that in any of these stories, right, they're doing something, and sometimes what they're doing is commenting on the values in a society. So, for example, if you are looking at a story like The Bunny Man, which is out of Northern Virginia, um, then the Bunny Man was supposedly an escaped mental patient, and he lives under a bridge, and he slaughters bunny rabbits and sometimes people. Um, the the what that functions, one of the functions of that story is to make people afraid of those who are mentally ill. Those are people to be feared because they behave in ways that we that break our taboos, right? Um, Even though many people kill and eat rabbits, the way that the bunny man kills and eats rabbits is somehow worse or aberrant, um, because apparently he's a mental patient and he lives under a bridge, and that's scary because he doesn't have a home. And so, some of the functions of that story, what it's doing for the society, is it's making us fear other people who aren't the same as we are, people who have a mental illness, people who don't have a home. It kind of reveals that anxiety in us. So, as you think about the ways that our society is changing, I want you to think about what Wilson has said here, um, and see if this still seems to be representative. You're going to have a question about that on this week's discussion board to discuss. I also want you to think about putting these 3 weeks of articles together where we talk about ghosts and haunted houses. This is the last week we're going to talk about those. So it's time for you to synthesize that information and kind of put it all together. And don't forget that you have your quiz this week. Again, it's over weeks 5, 6, and 7. Excuse me. And you will need to take that before Sunday night. And if you have questions about the midterm, please drop me an email and get in touch. Otherwise, I will talk to you guys next week, and I hope you enjoy your week. Bye.